In today's video, I'm going to go through the latest condominium market report for the entirety of the GTA and obviously the city of Toronto and York region as well, as was the case with the third quarter condominium report. Let's get to it. Hello everyone, this is Sam from SaberiSixRealEstate and Remax Realtron Realty. As always, feel free to find my contact information in the description box with regards to my office, my Instagram, and my Gmail. Feel free to get in touch with me with any questions you may have, any topics covered in this video or any topics covered in previous videos. If you have questions, reach out to me. Once again, my contact info in the description box. Lastly, if you appreciate or if you find these videos informative, it would be greatly appreciated for you guys to perhaps subscribe, comment, like, and review. You're not obliged to do so whatsoever. Your support in that regard is appreciated, but once again, not obliged. Before we get into the topic of today's video, which is the GTA condominium report, the third quarter of 2021, I have a post up on my channel, once again, asking for your questions for an upcoming Toronto real estate question and answer video, the third edition, whether it's about detached properties in Mississauga, condominiums in downtown, first-time home buyer questions, tenancy and real estate questions, generally speaking. Whatever the question is, feel free to ask it. The only ask I have of you is to make your questions as detailed and as specific as possible. In that way, I can give you the most detailed and precise answer myself. Anyways, enough of the housekeeping stuff. Let's get to the point of today's video, which is me covering the latest GTA condominium market report for the third quarter of 2021, right? Just to be clear, right? Just the third quarter of 2021. As we go through these numbers in this video, perform a year-over-year analysis and a quarter-over-quarter analysis. So some of the major key figures here will be comparing to a second quarter of 2021, how the condominium market around the GTA, downtown, midtown, North York, York region, wherever you're looking at, how these numbers and the market activity is performing compared to the second quarter of 2021 and also year over year, which means the third quarter of 2020. As always, we'll start with some of the more general figures, and then throughout the video, we'll get into more specific and niche figures. And of course, there's timestamps provided in the comments and in the description. You can find it on the bar. Feel free to zip around as you please. Find the parts of the video that interest you the most. Anyways, let's get started with the average sold price across all TREB areas, right? So for our purposes, as I always say, TREB areas and GTA can be thought of as pretty much equivalents. They're not technically equivalent, but practically speaking, for our purposes, you can think of all TREB areas as pretty much the greater Toronto area. Having said that, and moving forward, the average sold price in the third quarter of 2021, according to the Toronto and GTA condominium market report, was $689,000. Once again, keep in mind, this accounts for a condo that's sold in Whitby and a condo that's sold in Mississauga and downtown, midtown, right? This is all areas. So year over year, meaning comparing this to the third quarter of 2020, it is a noticeable improvement in terms of average selling price, wherein we see a 10% improvement because in the third quarter of 2020, we were looking at an average selling price of $633. So once again, around a 10, probably closer to 9% improvement in terms of average selling price, around $56,000 in pure dollar figure. Now we have to keep this in context because last third quarter, we were in the midst of a condo market that was relatively normal, but it was before the bottom that came about in the last quarter of 2020, the fourth quarter of 2020, where by all measures, really prices, listings, inventory, buyer demand, on all of these fronts in the fourth quarter of 2020, things took a substantial dip. And it was one of the really true moments in Toronto real estate history with regards to condominiums, where you can confidently actually say it was a buyer's market for once, especially as was the case with downtown. A lot of my clients made purchases in these areas, end users and investors alike, and it was a very opportunistic time to buy. Well, now we're talking about the third quarter, right? Not the fourth quarter. So here, when we're looking at the average price of 633, we have to keep it in the context that it is before the bottom that eventually came in the fourth quarter. And obviously, when discussing quarters here, towards the end of this third quarter, I think that's where some transactions may have weighed down this average to the point of 633. Now, this is year over year, quarter over quarter, right? When we compare the third quarter of 2021 with regards to the GTA and Toronto condominium market to the second quarter now, right? Looking at the second quarter of 2021. The second quarter of 2021 provided us with an average selling price for condominiums of 686. So barely lower than what we're looking at in the third quarter at 689. This is pretty consistent with what I've been talking about and seeing, and others have been discussing as well, not just me, is that overall condominium prices have been pretty consistent. Once again, when we take this larger, more macro perspective of all TREB areas, and pretty consistent since the highs of really truly February, March, and a couple of weeks into April, right? By May, things were calming down. And once again, that's more particularly with regards to City of Toronto, but it applied pretty universally as well. Quite interesting is when we move from the average selling price, in this case, to the number of transactions, so the number of sales. Of course, to you watching this, you're probably not a novice. You can tell the difference between sales and selling price, but a lot of people often, when they're reading, online publications, they don't really quite pick up on some of the tricks that a lot of people pull, where they say, 500% increase, for instance, in sales, and they kind of naturally equate sales to prices. It's not the same thing, right? It goes without saying for you guys, but I just want to make that clear, because the number of sales is more interesting to me in this case with regards to this report. Now, doing much of the same we did with the average selling price in the third quarter of 2021, according to this GTA and Toronto condominium market report, we see that the number of transactions that occurred in the third quarter of 2021 was 7,800, so 7,810 to be specific. Now, doing the same thing we did with the average price, we see that in terms of sales, it's also an increase, right? We see, much like we saw with average price, with the number of transactions, we also see an increase third quarter to third quarter, wherein in the third quarter of 2020, there was around 7,000 transactions, 7,072 to be precise. But where we depart from the average selling price is when we do the comparison of the number of sales of the third quarter of 2020 to the second quarter of 2020, wherein we see a dip in the number of transactions. If you recall, when we did the same thing with average price, we saw an increase, a very minimal marginal increase, albeit, but an increase nonetheless in average price from the second quarter of 2021 to the third quarter of 2021. Well, here we actually see a dip, because although in the third quarter of 2021, we're looking at 7,800 transactions with regards to the Toronto and GTA condominium market, in the second quarter of 2021, we're looking at 8,700 transactions, by a factor of 900 to 1,000 more transactions that occurred in the second quarter of 2021. Now, context for this is pretty simple. If you recall earlier in the year, just after the bottom that occurred in the fourth quarter of 2020, the first and second quarters of 2021 were very strong in terms of the condo market, especially with regards to the City of Toronto and the Toronto condo market, where we saw very high prices, mostly I will probably have to say in March, April, and maybe 2 weeks into May, where not only were there rampant bidding wars, but also a lot of buyer competition and obviously higher selling prices. So overall, the second quarter of 2021 was a much hotter market. And just to be clear, this wasn't only the case for condominiums. This was also the case for freehold properties such as semis and detached and townhomes as well. And this is why it's always complicated when you're trying to sell, let's say, a freehold property and buy a condo, or the other way around, right? Sell a condominium to upgrade or upsize to a freehold property, perhaps detached. It's almost next to impossible to time the market, right? If you really truly were trying to time the market, right, you would have to pick a time. For instance, in an example where you're selling a condominium to buy a detached, you would have to pick the perfect time to sell the condo where the condo market is hot, but at the same time, make sure that when you're buying for freeholds, in that very moment, that freehold properties are not even hotter than condominiums at that current moment in time. This is all to say, right? When you're looking at a sell-buy situation, whether you're selling a condo and then buying a freehold, or selling a freehold and then buying a condo, timing the market is very, very difficult. Now, moving on to the total number of listings, right? In the third quarter of 2021, there was a total of 12,000 listings. This is once again 12,000 condominiums that were offered for sale within the third quarter of 2021 with regards to condos for sale in the GTA, City of Toronto, Peel region, Durham, York region, just generally all over. So 12,000 is the figure we're looking at. Now, compared to the third quarter of 2020, this is a decrease. Where in the third quarter of 2020, we're looking at 17,000 listings. Quarter over quarter, we see a decrease of a number of listings, number of condos offered for sale of around 5,000. Now, why is this the case? For wider context, we have to realize where we really were in the third quarter of 2020. Once again, it was right before the fourth quarter of 2020 where things really truly bottomed out, and it was a buyer's market, truly speaking, right? But nonetheless, it was the summer months, and I hate to speak in code, but the worldwide event at that current moment in time was still fresh and new. A lot of people no longer wanted to live in condominiums, right? They would much rather leave a condominium, liquidate their condominium in a central location such as Midtown, let's say, for instance, and move further up north or further east, further west into the suburbs, either to rent in the suburbs or to buy in the suburbs. And that's just from the end user's perspective. A lot of investors, you have to understand the rental market in the third quarter of 2020 was very, very weak, right? So a lot of investors were taking losses in terms of their monthly cash flow, coming in at a negative cash flow, right? So they were not really getting the rental income to cover their costs. And once again, this applies to mostly, more middle to lower tier investors who own maybe a condo here, a condo there, and they're buying with 20% down, maybe 15% down. Not, the larger, more upscale investors who have an expansive portfolio, who are often buying with 50% to 60% to 40%, whatever percentage is, definitely more than 25% down. They were less so impacted, but nonetheless impacted on both the end user front and the investor base, right? A lot of people were incentivized to get out the condo market in the third quarter of 2020, which led to the bottom of the fourth quarter of 2020. That's why we saw a higher number of listings to the tune of 17,000. A lot of people tried to liquidate their assets in that sense. And a lot of people were not successful. If we recall back to the number of transactions, the number of sales in this third quarter of 2020, we were looking at 7,000 sales. Now compare this to the number of listings, 17,000. There's a gap and a discrepancy of 10,000, right? In other words put, out of the 17,000 units put on market for sale, only 7,000 sold. Whereas in the third quarter of 2021, that gap is far, far smaller, and condominiums were and are selling at a higher and much healthier rates. Now, harkening back to the second quarter now of 2021, where we saw 14,000 listings, and comparing this obviously to the third quarter of 2021, quarter over quarter now, as we did with average selling price, we see a dip of 2,000 listings. So in the second quarter of 2021, there were 14,000 listings, and in the third quarter of 2021, there was 12,000 listings as aforementioned. And this reflects a couple of key issues here, simply dwindling supply, right? And prices are pretty much even quarter over quarter. Of course, they're not as hot as they were in the second quarter, right? The reason we, in my opinion, see a dip of this 2,000 listings is overall having to do with the fact that the condo market in into the third quarter cooled down a tiny bit. Nonetheless, it's still a seller's market. A condominium market cooling down is not equivalent of now it all of a sudden becoming a buyer's market. Still a seller's market. Buyers are, unfortunately for them, but fortunately for obviously sellers, they are still under pressure, and there's a lot of competition amongst buyers. Now moving on to breaking down just the city of Toronto. Right now we went from the GTA at large. Now we're going to break down just the city of Toronto with regards to the Toronto condo market. The third quarter of 2021, the city of Toronto saw overall about 5,200 transactions, which, if you recall, overall the GTA at large TREB areas, we were looking at 7,800. So this should really show you that how big of a portion the city of Toronto makes up of when we're talking about the TREB areas at large, because of that 7,800 transactions, 5,200 of them belong to the city of Toronto. The average selling price with regards to the city of Toronto in the third quarter of 2021 was $726,000. Now, when we compare the third quarter of 2021 with regards to the Toronto condo market to the third quarter of 2020, we see an increase on both fronts, the average selling price and the number of transactions. Wherein the average selling price in the third quarter of 2020 was around $680,000. So it went from $680 to $726. And in the number of sales, we went from 4,000 transactions in the third quarter of 2020 to now, once again, 5,200 transactions in the third quarter of 2021. Now, looking at it quarter over quarter, and this is what's very consistent with what I've been talking about in recent months on all my videos, to pat myself on the back, unfortunately. Because when we look at the number of transactions quarter over quarter, the number of transactions have dipped. And when we look at the average selling price has actually increased. So we were looking at 726 in the third quarter of 2021, and in the second quarter of 2021 we were looking at 721. So a very marginal slight increase of 5,000. Now, to finish this video off with just the downtown core, the downtown portions of City of Toronto, which were designated as C1 here, although C8 and C2 are obviously parts of downtown as well. The numbers here show us a precipitous and slow increase, more so quarter over quarter. Year over year, it's more of a glaring increase in average sold price with regards to the downtown Toronto condo market. In the third quarter of 2021, with regards to the downtown Toronto condo market, the average selling price was around $804,000 based on 1,400 transactions. This represents around $16,000 increase quarter over quarter, because in the second quarter of 2021 the average selling price was around $784,000. This was based on more transactions, 1,600 transactions. But the sharpest contrast to the third quarter of 2021 is implicated when we take a look at the third quarter of 2020, so year over year, where the average the average selling price in the third quarter of 2020 was $755,000 with regards to the condo market in downtown Toronto. A $50,000 increase around that figure, $50,000 year over year. Anyways, there's so much more I can go through. I'm going to keep some of the numbers with regards to Peel region, York region, other condominium markets with regards to the GTA. I'm going to keep some of those numbers for future videos. This video is long enough as it is. As always, if you have any further questions, feel free to get in touch with me. My contact information in the description box with regards to my Gmail, my Instagram, and my office. Let me know if there's any particular questions in the comments as well. And feel free to subscribe, comment, rate, and review. As always, I really appreciate the fact that you take the time out of your day to watch these videos and get in touch with me. So that's greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for watching. Stay safe and stay tuned. Thank you.